Hi, I'm here today with Heidi Bullock from Marketo.
Hi,
Heidi.
thanks for having me.
Absolutely, we're very glad to have you. So Heidi is a subject matter expert on content marketing, and what we're going to be focusing on today is thinking about the buyer's journey and thinking about that from a content marketing perspective, and not just the acquisition stage, but all the way to advocacy. So I know this is an important topic to you, so
it is.
Any kind of high-level things we want to hit on?
Yeah, I mean, first off, thank you for having me. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation because I think in a lot of marketing organizations today, it's really easy to focus on acquisition. It's a really important thing for all marketers, but it's being a little short-sighted if you just think about that, because you could, in theory, bring in 20,000 leads in a month, but if they're not ultimately becoming customers or maybe even churning after a short period of time, that's not driving the business impact that you want. So I think that it's really, really important to think about all the stages, and then content is really, to me, the glue that holds everything together. It's critical for your brand. We all know today there's more noise in the market than ever before. So standing out is kind of the first part of that. You have to be known by a buyer, right, for them to find interest and even spend time with you. Absolutely. So critical for acquisition, definitely, and definitely important for demand gen programs, but you definitely want to think about the content path and that journey that maps to your buyer.
Absolutely, and we've been pushing to our partners, really thinking through the different things that you need to accomplish at each stage. I know we do push demand gen quite a bit, but thinking about offering software as a service and kind of the churn that comes with that and creating customer loyalty, thinking about actually that content marketing post-sale is actually going to be an ever-increasing piece for us to consider.
Definitely, it's really important.
So I know this is a little bit of a complex question, but what are some of the high-level pieces of analytics that marketers should think about in terms of the different stages of the buyer's journey?
Sure. I think the first thing to think about is definitely identify what your business objective is for each of those stages. So in theory, you could have, maybe it's awareness as one aspect, and you're ultimately trying to drive that. Then you might have conversion, and then you might have retention and advocacy, just as an example. And so for each of those, what I like to suggest is, what is your business outcome first? What are you driving towards? So maybe for awareness, that might be, we want share of voice. That's ultimately what you're trying to measure, but then working back from that, what are the programs and key metrics you're going to look at along the way? So that might be engagement on your website. How many visitors are you getting after you do a specific PR campaign? And is that hitting that mark? Maybe for retention, you're looking at, we want to have greater than 90% retention rate. That's the business outcome, but that might take a year to measure. So what are the programs and metrics along the way that you're going to take a look at? So I think it's just really important to start with, I often say, what's the press release you want at the end of the year, and what are those statements? Right. And then work back from that and figure out, there might be early stage metrics, middle stage, and then late stage. And I think mapping those out's the right way to do it. And for each of those kind of areas of the buyer's journey, they'll be a little bit different. So maybe for retention, just going back to that example, it might be utilization. It might be logins. That could be an early stage indicator. Then it might be how many integrations do you have with other software as service companies. And then if all of that goes well, you should have great retention, as an example.
Yeah, and so you're kind of hitting on some of what I wanted to go a little bit deeper while we have you, but
Sure.
you talk in a lot of your blogs and you have some great stuff on the importance of content marketing, but I know that we spend a lot of our efforts and a lot of our partners spend their efforts on, again, that pre-sales content marketing, right? So have you seen any good examples of content marketing that are post-sales?
Absolutely, and I think it's actually no different, and in some ways it's more important, because I think we all know it's a lot more cost effective to keep customers than to keep bringing in new ones. And by increasing retention, I think even 5%, it can impact your revenue to 20 to 95%. So that's meaningful. And so you really want to think about, once somebody's a customer, what can you do to make sure that they're happy, they stay loyal, they stay engaged with you? And it's almost, in a way, it's harder. It's almost like marriage. It's like keeping that person excited over time. It's still going to be a lot of work, right? And so I think one of the things that we think a lot about is, often with software, people will get into the how very, very quickly. Here's how you use a feature. This is, the steps you take, without really getting to, well, why? Why do I want to use that capability? I think many people that market software will, once they look at their usage metrics, realize people use such a small fraction of what's available.
Right.
But it's a lot of education. It's almost starting over with awareness. What are the key capabilities in the software that can really address a pain point for that individual? And then you can get into the specific how to do it. But they need to know the why first. So I think that's a good strategy, and I definitely feel like there's companies that, market software and their user base is so important to them, and that's really critical. And I think, I actually feel we do a decent job with it because we certainly know, for an example, our nurture capability. We know if people use that capability, they stay customers for life. So we spend a lot of time talking about, here's the value, here's why you should get excited, this is a great capability, and a way to map out their strategy, and then we get into the how.
Great. And then do you actually connect it to like making sure that the sales team is selling it right kind of from the beginning?
Absolutely.
And then making sure that you're educating that buyer even after they've made the purchase?
That's exactly right. And definitely I want to emphasize, you can't leave out your sales team in any of this. I mean, they're just in a way, we talk a lot about people being on multiple channels and engaging across a variety of different channels, and your sales team's just another channel. So they have to be equipped no different than you would prepare your marketing team to do a pay-per-click campaign or anything else.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that you also mentioned is that content isn't free, and we know it costs a lot of money.
It's not free.
Absolutely. And one of the studies that we did, we found that over 80% of our partners actually say that of all the things that they have to do from a marketing perspective, they struggle with creating fresh and relevant content the most. And so sometimes I think that's almost so daunting that people just don't invest.
Right.
So do you have any advice on how you actually encourage people to start investing here?
Yeah, I think it's two things. I think realizing, and I mentioned this earlier, content is critical. There isn't an aspect of a buyer's journey where it doesn't play a role, and it's really important. If you don't do it, you're going to be left behind, and that's a pure fact. And I think intellectually a lot of companies know that, but you're right. It's like they need to see, well, how is this impacting my investment? And I think that there's different ways of doing it. I think that there's 2 points I want to make. I'll get to the metrics, but the first thing I would highlight is, in many cases, content that works well. More content isn't always better. And so sometimes I think I see people get in the trap. There's the diminishing returns concept we all learned in college, and it's not always about more. It's about repurposing and being clever with what you have. So if you know something's successful, think about that. Now, 2, you can think about, we've actually done something very simple. People can do this without additional software. We have a weighted index for our blog. So we basically will just look at, what's getting good traction versus last month versus last year, so we get a real sense of what an engagement is looking like, and then maybe if it's really great, we can create a content asset out of that. Then we're fortunate because we're Marketo, so we use marketing automation. We tag our content. So from an early stage, I can basically measure it entire way through, and I can see, here's the pipeline that's associated with that content asset. So we measure every content asset that we do, and I can tie it all back to the pipeline that's created for our company.
And that also gives you a good baseline for future content where you can see, how does this perform versus this other thing we did, or are certain months slower for getting engagement with certain types of content?
Yeah, it's been interesting because we've seen certain content will do better in Europe versus the US. We've seen some content is very, very important for acquisition, but then for deal acceleration, we'll see it might be something completely different. But I think once you can put numbers to those content assets, then people will see, wow, there's real value to this. This is making a real difference. And then you can do what all of us want to do, which is get more money and more people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you also talk about benchmarks a lot. And I think that that's really difficult, especially for a lot of companies that are starting to think about investing in digital marketing and planning out that kind of, whether it's an account-based marketing strategy or inbound marketing, all of these different things, they don't have the benchmark. So if they're new to measuring these sorts of things, what should they think about there? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I might have something a little controversial on this, and we can see what you think. But in general, I think benchmarks are helpful. You certainly can do a Google search and come up with email benchmarks, content benchmarks, but I'm a big believer that every business you want to look at what's working for you, because what might work for me at Marketo might not work for a pharmaceutical company. That's a very, very different audience, completely different. So I think it's good to have some benchmarks that you can find, but I think it's mostly critical for your own business to kind of say, this is what we're striving to, this would be a good outcome for us, and you put a stake in the ground and see how close you can get to that. In many cases, we run new programs at Marketo. I don't know how something's going to perform, but we do, we put a stake in the ground and we see how close we can get to that. And it's about getting better for your company. It's not really measuring yourself to somebody else.
Yeah,
even if it's a similar industry, I just think there's so much variability there.
Absolutely. I think that's great. And then you have kind of some great perspective on where you really see marketers struggle. Can you kind of list the top 2 or 3 areas where you see marketers struggle, any advice to kind of get over those humps?
Sure. I think one of the main areas I see marketers struggle is where often they will focus right away on tactics. Because tactics are fun, they're kind of sexy. It's like there's Periscope, there's Meerkat, there's this the latest video technology, whatever it may be. I think people sometimes spend too much time there without stopping and saying, but what is the objective of what I'm trying to accomplish? And you should always start with what is that outcome I'm trying to reach, and then work back from there to figure out the tactics come later. And so I think that's important. I think another—
So clearly defined goals.
Yes, and I think another area that marketers sometimes struggle with is, they'll say, well, I wonder what metrics I should be using, and I think, or even terminology. And in many cases, I think, if it's with your marketing team, you can talk about Facebook likes, you can talk about your Twitter followers. That's great, but if you're talking to a C-level person, they're just going to say that's not as relevant to them. They want to know what's the pipeline you're driving, what's the revenue, what do sales look like. And so I don't think either one's bad. It's just you need to know who you're speaking with and always keep that in mind.
Great. Yeah. No. And then just making sure that everyone's clearly aligned on the criteria of what you're going after, how you're going to measure it. And so that's kind of, again, that sales and marketing alignment.
That's right. And communicating that up front. I think in so many cases, it's like going in with sales and saying, we're going to run this program. We're going to see, close won deals from this, or, whatever it may be at 6 months. And we'll evaluate then. But early on, we're going to know if this is a success if we get, a lot of demos at the booth. And I think it's just kind of communicating those steps along the way.
Sure. So just kind of clearly setting expectations. Here's what we're going to accomplish when. So people aren't disappointed when maybe you are having success.
Exactly.
It just takes a little bit of time.
It's like telling your girlfriend you're going to be late for dinner.
That's
Same thing.
a good metaphor. All right, so final question for you. There's so much noise out there when it comes to just content that we're blasted with. I think you were saying on one of your webinars that you get hit with 15 ebooks a day versus you used to get one and think you have to read it. So you're staying up to date. So with just so much noise out there, how can businesses and organizations think about marketing their content to cut through that noise?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's really topical. I think the number one thing is knowing who your buyer is. And again, it's not looking at one company and saying, wow, they're having great success with X, we should do that. It's taking a step back and saying, who is my buyer? What do they really care about? It's almost creating content for imagining that's your boss and not thinking about your company. It's that person is your boss. What's the content they're going to care about? And a lot of what we talk about is marketing and content that's engaging, and that's being personal, relevant, and timely. And all of those things, I think everyone listening to this is going to say, yeah, it makes tons of sense.
Absolutely.
It's more, how do you do those things? And that's where I think it can get a little tricky. It's like telling somebody just be smarter or just be more interesting. Well, sure, but how do you do that? And so I think that to me is really where I see marketing automation playing a big role, because I can deliver something to somebody at the right time for them. I have the ability to be personal and do that in a way that scales. And so I think that those are really important things. And I think if your content can be personal, relevant, and timely, and really speak to that buyer in a format that's meaningful for them, you'll stand out. And the best thing I can say is, don't necessarily just copy what everybody else is doing. Figure out that mix for you, and again, be original. Because again, there's a lot of Me Too out there, and I think one way we've been successful is just really looking at the marketer, what they care about, and trying new things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of just to add on to that, one of the things that I've seen a lot of marketers be successful with is they actually have to work to iterate on this before they become good. A lot of people say, oh, that person's great at it, and they've just always been great. And it's like, they were terrible for a year or two or three or four, right? And they kept iterating, and they kept finding what didn't work, what did, and then building on that success.
That's right. It's always about getting better.
Yeah, awesome. So Heidi told us a lot of really great things in a very short amount of time. So I just want to kind of make sure I recap and make sure we kind of hit the top things.
Sure.
So one, from a content marketing perspective, it's really important to think about acquisition all the way to advocacy. You can't just stop at the purchase stage, right?
And in some ways, as we talked about, it's even more important, right?
It really is.
So once somebody's a customer,
maximizing that value and keeping that customer.
Right, exactly.
Yep, and then clearly understanding and defining the goals and ROI from the onset with all of your stakeholders.
That's right.
Thinking about how you'll measure the results. You can use marketing automation. If you can't use that, use things like Google Analytics.
That's right.
And then making sure, again, everyone agrees on that criteria and set clear expectations.
Exactly.
Right? Awesome.
They're actually pretty simple.
Yeah, simple in theory, right?
In theory.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Heidi, for your time today. And
Great.
I think we have some great tips for you guys to get started on your content marketing strategy.
Thanks.